You cannot get rid of dictatorship and authoritarians without a change in the ownership of wealth in society. Um, but again, towards Stalinists, they have a focus on the Irish Communist Party, for instance. They have a focus on the sovereignty and independence. One in their program is Ireland divided and partitioned is weakened and dominated and controlled by imperialism. Socialism cannot be victorious while subject to imperialism and capitalism in this country. National liberation and independence, therefore, are necessary for socialism. This is the famous Stalinist, the infamous Stalinist stages theory at work, because they imagine that an Irish bourgeoisie can take power in the north of Ireland, presumably massacring hundreds of thousands of Protestants or something, I don't know, and then being strong enough to take on imperialism. This bourgeoisie doesn't exist, and if it did exist, I mean, imagine trying to take it on if it somehow had fallen from the sky. It would then be strong enough to beat down the Irish working class, presumably. The Irish bourgeoisie have had 100 years. They're incapable. They've gone through many policy shifts in trying to develop the Irish economy, and they've been incapable of it. They've again and again reverted to the dead end of reliance on foreign capital and on imperialism. Now, just talk briefly about the origins of Trotskyism, which I won't go into in too much detail. I've already touched on it massively. That it arose. The Trotskyists, for instance, in Russia call themselves the Bolshevik Leninists, and it's a shame we have to call ourselves Trotskyists because we're not the ones who swooped in with weird new ideas and theories. We're the continuation and development of Leninist ideas and Bolshevik organization in resistance to the bureaucratic twisting and utter distortion of Leninism and the turning of the revolutionary party into a machine of oppression under Stalinist bureaucracy. Trotskyism is international and proletarian, scientific and dialectical socialism. Stalinism is nationalistic, bureaucratically distorted, a formalistic servant of a bureaucracy which no longer exists. The stages through which Trotskyism has developed historically, I think first of all we need to talk about the 1930s and the 1940s. Churchill and Stalin were talking in the late stages of World War II, saying, you know, we have to get a handle on Europe, we have to get a lid on Europe, we have to divide it up between us and really take control of the situation. Otherwise, the only one who will benefit from the fall of Hitler will be Trotsky. Trotsky being dead at this stage, of course. But Churchill continued to see Trotsky's ghost everywhere. For instance, in Greece, when there was a socialist movement that was independent of Stalinism, he very correctly said, he very correctly characterized them as Trotskyists. Well, you know, not entirely correctly, but in general. If you look at the 1930s, 1933, of course, the coming to power of Hitler proved the rottenness of the Comintern and led to Trotsky's turn towards creating a new international. And if you read back the documents of that international, such as the transitional program, you can see another world that was possible in the 1930s. To have the massive slaughter of World War II, the slaughter of millions that came before it and that followed after it, and the putrid Cold War that developed out of it. Another world was absolutely possible, a socialist world. And we see events such as the Minneapolis Teamsters strike, in which the Trotskyists were a leading force. You can see these imminent possibilities in, for instance, society in the US and in Europe. However, the Trotskyist currents here and elsewhere were unable to decisively affect the course of history because of the massive strength of Stalinism and the social democracy, and enormously as well because of state repression. Churchill and Hitler, Stalin and Roosevelt, practically everyone spent their time persecuting and hounding Trotskyists. The only ones to survive massive, vicious, murderous repression intact were the rather weak British Trotskyists and the comparatively, relatively strong American Trotskyists. And in the post-war revolutionary movements in the USA, for instance, the SE decisively strengthened themselves, no relative of the current British and Irish SWP. But elsewhere, they were dramatically weakened by the war, simply by state repression and by being unable to contest the field adequately with Stalinism and social democracy. The next period we need to talk about is the 1950s to the 1980s, and the key factors in this were an era of a new consensus in Western Europe and USA, a broadly social democratic consensus with massive concessions to the working class, Secondly, an era of Stalinist power in Eastern Europe, USSR and China. And thirdly, revolts in the colonial countries. All three of these developments were cut across. The new consensus was cut across by the economic crisis, leading to victory of neoliberalism. The Stalinist bureaucracy stagnated and declined, proving that democracy, without democracy, a planned economy can't possibly work. And the colonial revolts came face to face with the limits of independence under capitalism. The key features, therefore, for the Trotskyist movement were pressures towards opportunism and Stalinism. In a stable situation, the breakdown of consensus and the consensus itself provided opportunities, however, for the Trotskyist movement. So if you look, for instance, at the Fourth International, the stability that came about saw them, on the one hand, turning towards increasingly opportunistic, pro-bourgeois politics, on the other hand, turning to guerrillaism. With the militant tendency in the UK, however, you see a constant rising curve of membership from the foundation in the 60s through the 70s to the 80s, a spectacular rising curve, which was cut across dramatically in the late 80s with the change in the situation. It's because they were working at the point of most potential gains in the main Social Democratic Party, winning over radical and working class youth and others. They showed an ability to think, as evidenced by that document I sent around, a massive analytical and theoretical ability, but more importantly, an ability to fight, an ability to lead working class struggles. Most prominently, the Liverpool dispute and the poll tax. And if we look at the American SWP, we see an altogether less promising developments. We see repeated splits in Stalinist, in Maoist and guerrillaist directions. We see an increasingly opportunist line being pursued, and finally in 1981 the abandonment of the theory of the permanent revolution, just so that they could cozy up to Cuba, Nicaragua and Grenada, who seemed like so much the voices of the past now, but must have seemed like such a exciting and vibrant thing at the time, tempting them away from their principles. Another important thing for the SWP was, for the American SWP, was the influx of middle-class youth from the 1960s protest movements, which decisively changed the composition of the party. And whether you like it or not, despite everyone's best intentions, this just changes the composition of a revolutionary party. Petty bourgeois elements decisively weaken such a party. I think another point we have to make about the SWP was their fairly catastrophist perspectives. Sort of revolution in the next 10 years, which the militant tendency was also at times guilty of, and that you can't be that definite about things. That, I mean, even if there's no revolution on the cards immediately, the Marxist still has a task of building a militant, confident working class movement and building a revolutionary party. And these tasks, perhaps for a future generation to use as weapons against capitalism. And these tasks should not be in any way denigrated by implication. The third period I want to talk about is the period of 1990s to 2007. We're talking about the victory of neoliberalism, the collapse of Stalinism, massive growth of finance capital, rising profits and declining capital expenditure, growth of digital industries, and the massive limits of independence in the backward countries, the industrialization also of many of them. This period put a massive stop to the gallop of all working class parties and movements. If you look at the militant, as I was saying, from a rising massive curve to 8,000 members in Britain in the late 80s, you see